Welcome to our Green Sunday program. Tonight, it's going to be Dr. James McFadden, and I'm looking forward very much to this topic. It's entitled Criminal Syndicates, Mafia, CIA, and Politicians, the Enterprise-Octopus as a Part of the Ruling Class. I'm in a book group with James, and we've talked about this a little bit, but certainly not all the details that are going to get covered tonight. So I'm really looking forward to it. Take a quick look at James's bio here. Dr. James McFadden is a research physicist at the University of California, Berkeley. For the past 15 years, he has studied history, economics, and political science, especially as it involves the U.S. empire. He also spends some time working with the Greens and other organizations on issues of democracy and social justice. Well, James, take it away.
All right. Um, First, I'm going to cover a lot of ground on this talk. And what I hope to leave you with is a sense of post-World War II history and criminal collusion between intelligence agencies, the criminal underworld, politicians, and a particular syndicate that I'm going to call the Enterprise, which is one of the things they internally called themselves. Before I address this history, though, I want to address a little bit of the psychology of those. So before I get to the history, you'll see that. There will be a lot of slides. Don't try to read them. There's way too much. I won't be reading them. This will be recorded, so if you want to see the full quotes or read the backup information, you can go back to these slides in the recording. Um, I'm going to using these slides primarily to keep my narrative on track and to provide some background that supports the story and narrative I'm going to tell. Um, Instead, I just suggest you look at the slide titles and the pictures, who are the cast of characters that are involved in this. Lastly, this is a work in progress, an attempt to make sense of the books that I've been reading for the last decade and the books that I found useful. I always start off my talks with a summary of what I hope you come away with, and so I'm going to do that here. Um, the Enterprise is a syndicate that acts as a private CIA. The CIA leadership origins are in the Eastern banking establishment, and banking is essential for their money laundering and control of the gold and drug markets. Intelligence ties to the criminal underworld began during World War II, and it was Japanese and German loot confiscated after World War II and put in the Black Eagle Trust that became the seed money for this private intelligence syndicate that I call the Enterprise. The Black Eagle Trust is used illegally to control post-World War II politics and to develop profit-making enterprises in drugs, arms, and fraud, which fund covert actions. When the Enterprise controls the White House, the lines are blurred between the CIA and Enterprise, but when out of power, the Enterprise acts independently. In the 1980s, the Enterprise ran Iran-Contra and profited from the savings and loan frauds primarily to the benefit of the Republican Party. And lastly, I hope I get to this, is Ferdinand Marcos's massive wealth, which was derived from Yamashita's gold, which I'll be talking about, which is really the Japanese loot, was taken by the Enterprise and used to facilitate the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so what this bottom thing, these connections between banking and the CIA enterprise and the criminal underworld is what I primarily want to focus on. So the goal is to understand the role of intelligence services and criminal syndicates as necessary for imperialism, Western imperialism. And I'll draw upon historical research of about 45 authors, and I'll list them in a second. And I want you to think capitalism at its base is really a conspiracy of elites. It's a rigged system. And the types of rigging is, limited liabilities, the protection of property over human rights, super profits, the control of money, and intelligence agencies which act as a secret police to corrupt foreign nations. The enterprise itself is a covert ops syndicate involving members of the CIA, military, ex-military, criminal underworld, bankers, key executives, directors, and politicians. It's organized around anti-communism, promoting corporate capitalism and supporting the Republican Party, although some Democrats, like the Clintons, were tied into it. A couple of definitions to start out. I'm going to use the term syndicate, and by that I just mean a group of individuals or organizations that are combined to promote some common interests. And I'll use the term cabal when I'm really talking about is the leadership faction of a syndicate. The syndicate I'm talking about is the Enterprise, but it also goes by other names. Danny Casolaro called it the Octopus. Early on, they referred to themselves as an umbrella when they were running all of these bank accounts. They also referred to themselves as the cause. And the cabal, or the people at the top of that, are sometimes referred to as the secret team. And I would say the Enterprise is part of the deep state, but it's not the whole deep state. It's just a piece of it. It's got all of the functionality of a intelligence agency, including cutouts, limited hangouts, and contract agents, which are all used to provide deniability. This is just a brief list, and I'm going to do this in a number of these slides. I'm going to just flip them up long enough so that if you want to go back and look at it, but this is a brief list of some of the books that I've drawn from for this analysis. And these are some of the authors involved that I've taken most of it, my analysis from, including the story about Danny Casolaro, who was murdered while investigating the Enterprise or the Octopus. And these are some quotes from them you can come back and look at, where they all refer to this organization, which is the same organization that really dates back to World War II. And a lot of my analysis will involve these two down in the corner, Sterling and Peggy Seagrave, and their book, Gold Warriors. And the reason I mention that is because Gold Warriors was kind of what really caught me. This is the first one I list up here. Really, at the beginning, caught my attention. And part of the reason it caught my attention is because it was basically validated by Chalmers Johnson, who's a historian who I first started reading about when I read his trilogy, Blowback, Nemesis, and Sorrows of Empire. And he was an expert on the Far East, and believes the story that they tell in Gold Warriors, plus the fact that they include all their evidence with the book. They included CDs with the book with all their evidence. That it's a very believable story. I'm going to leave this up just for a second. You can go back, but this is a timeline that I'm going to kind of go through. And if you want to go back and look at that at a later time. I want to start out with just this idea that it's not a conspiracy theory, but it's a business strategy. And this is something that Mickey Huff said that I thought was really applies to this, because a lot of people think, oh, it's just a conspiracy theory. And but what we want to understand is the reproduction of criminal enterprises, and we need to recognize how psychologies work and how they treat each other and trust each other, and the common personality types involved, and their strategies that require mechanisms to extract wealth out of the economy, in fact, to make super profits, and the need for a banking and money laundering system for all this to work. And who are the marks? The marks are the American taxpayers, and they use control of these institutions to be able to make sure that to provide protections to those who are forming the frauds. It relies also on the American public's unfounded belief that they're not being manipulated and that conspiracies are not real. So these are some of the sociopaths that we've had that run the CIA, and I just want to read a couple of lines from quotes from them. From Mike Pompeo: "I was a CIA director. We lied, we cheated, we stole. We had entire training courses on that. It reminds me of the glory of the American experiment." Or James Angleton: "The better you lied and the more you betrayed, the more likely you would be promoted." Or Casey, who said or claims to have said, "We know our disinformation program is complete when everything the American public believes is false." But I want to go to one of the agents, Ralph McKee, who said, "The CIA is not an intelligence agency. In fact, it's largely an anti-intelligence agency, producing only that information wanted by policymakers to support their plans and suppressing information that does not support their plans." And we saw that in the case of the Iraq War in 2003, where all the WMD propaganda. And I also want to say that every president since Nixon declared his war on drugs has supported the war on drugs and simultaneously allowed the CIA and the DEA and the Enterprise to run drug operations. So there's a hypocrisy here in this thing. Now, why is all of this organized? It's organized because we have ruling elites who create institutions to maintain their power. And they created these institutions with super profits. The super profits for these wealthy families came from oil, banking, chemicals, shipping, steel, and drugs. And today, I think we can add tech to the super profit engine. And there's a bunch of structures that they have that are listed here. I won't go into them except to say that the CIA, what do they serve? They're really the secret police for the empire, and that's what we should think of them. And there's a great line by de Balzac, behind every great fortune lies a great crime. And a perfect example of that is the Roosevelts. How did the Roosevelts get so wealthy? Well, they were running opium during the Opium Wars, and you can read about that in the book China Mirage. And lastly, I want to just mention that this line from Michael Rupert's book, that the CIA is Wall Street and Wall Street's the CIA. And it's this interconnection between banking and the CIA that's extremely important. So who are the toadies of the ruling class? Well, these are the guys that do the dirty work and hopefully someday in hopes of joining the overlord. So there's the Dulles brothers, who were state and CIA heads during Eisenhower. And they were the servants of the Harrimans and the Morgans that I showed you just a minute ago, and the Rockefellers. And the Bush family similarly climbed up doing favors for the robber barons. Another person is this guy, John McCloy, who was a comer. He was a top Rockefeller man and head of the World Bank. And these were some of the spiders who wove the web, linking the Fed to Black Eagle Trust and the M Fund and Project Hammer and the CIA. And the only reason, James Angleton, another one of these spiders, said the only reason he was named chief of counterintelligence at the CIA was because he had taken an oath that he would never subject the Dulles brothers to lie detector tests about their collusion with the Nazi Party bankers of the 1930s. And again, these are quotes from the Seagrave book. Lawyers are another middleman in this organized crime business, and so you have to have them as your go-betweens. You can see here Trump with Roy Cohn, with his ties to the mob. Johnson had Bobby Baker and Corcoran. Reagan had Korshak through his connections to MCA Records, and this was Nixon's mob lawyer. And so these guys are seen throughout presidential administrations. And you can read about that in Jonathan Marshall's Dark Quadrant. The psychology of national security matters. This is also important. And there's this great book, Richard Barnett, Roots of War. And the first lesson a national security manager learns is that toughness is the most highly prized virtue. To be repelled by mass homicide is to be irresponsible. We clearly see that going on in Gaza and now in Iran. Those who recommend more killing do not seriously jeopardize their position. And this was written based on his experience with national security managers back in 1971. And it includes a system of absolution that operates within those structures to transform reasonably law-abiding professors and bankers into killers. And this is part of the real problem with that. And you can go back and read a couple of quotes by Blinken and Sullivan who really fit that model. Now, the psychology of the agents, not just the national security managers, is important. And they act as secret police, and they become abusive of people and set themselves above the law. So they really act like rogue agents, like you see in the James Bond. In fact, according to this personality portrait, the CIA wants active, charming, obedient people who can get things done in the social world, but have limited perspective and understanding, and who see things in black and white and don't like to think too much. And that's exactly what you would think with James Bond. And in Jennifer Harbury's book, obviously the CIA officials knew and intended that the detainees would be tortured and took active steps to promote and support the illegal practice. Now, part of the system is you also need a two-tiered education system. I'm not going to say much about that, but we have the upper tier of Harvard and Yale to create our national security managers to turn those bankers into killers. And you have a filtering system that starts in kindergarten, and the rest of us are generally relegated to the lower level, state and college and city college universities. Um, you can go back and read these. There's some great quotes by Chomsky about this two-tiered education system. And of course, you need a corporate media. And it's important to recognize that six corporations control 90% of the media, and that these guys it's important to bear in mind that the political campaigns are designed by the same people who sell toothpaste and cars. I think that's a great line by Chomsky. But the way to really think about this is from Edward Bernays. He said, the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element of democratic society. What he's saying there is that we have to be manipulated, us, the masses, have to be manipulated in order to create a democratic society. It's just turning things on its head. And there's a great book by Sheldon Wolin, Democracy Incorporated, that was written, I think, about 2006. And he says, corruption is not an anomaly, but an essential element of the functioning of managed democracy. And that's what I want to talk about. It's this corruption, this connections between criminal activities and the intelligence agencies. And an example of this is Rupert Murdoch. Rupert Murdoch isn't somebody who just kind of, by chance rose up to be this media mogul. He was funded initially by Ted Shackley, one of the key people in the Enterprise and in the CIA early on, to build his empire. And that's why his Fox News network is continually putting out the correct messaging that the CIA and the Enterprise wants to be seen. And you can read, some of these quotes at some other time. But we also see the same thing with our tech media nowadays, with Larry Ellison, Elon Musk, and Jeff Bezos. All these guys are getting into media because we want our billionaires controlling this messaging for the rest of us. And there's a great line, was said by William Colby, who was one of the CIA chiefs. The Central Intelligence Agency owns everyone of any significance in the major media. For him to have said that. And how did the CIA get so much influence on our media? Through a project called Operation Mockingbird. You can go look up that, you can go wiki it and find out what it's all about. But, the original operation reportedly involved 3,000 CIA operatives and hired over 400 journalists to be able to manipulate the media. And you can kind of see this in this kind of blurry screenshot where you have elements like the Trilateral Commission, the Council on Foreign Relations, and the Bilderberg, all controlling this giant media network to keep us propagandized. And I always like to bring in a little bit of the movies. Some of the movies have really captured my imagination. And one of the greatest lines, I think, is in 3 Days of the Condor, where Joe Turner, played by Robert Redford, says, maybe there's another CIA inside the CIA. And that's exactly what the Enterprise is. It's this kind of internal aspect, at least when the CIA, when the Enterprise controls the presidency. But a couple other lines. This in Brill, in The Enemy of the State, says the government's been in bed with the entire telecommunications industry since the 40s. The more technology is used, the easier it is for them to keep tabs on you. Well, this was written 15 years before we got all this from Snowden. Or when a country has 5% of the world population and does 50% of the military spending, then persuasive powers of that country are on the decline. And that's, I think, why you see us, the United States, struggling so much. We think we can just keep squeezing the world, and it's all slipping through our fingers. And it's not, this line from the International was one that really caught me years ago. And what the movie was, it's a great action movie. And one of the things that comes out is that the banks are funding both sides of a war, and the journalists, the Interpol agents that are looking into it, are trying to figure this out, and it's explained to them. This is not about making a profit from weapons sales. It's about control. It's a bank. Their objective isn't to control the conflict. It's to control the debt that the conflict produces. And I think that's an important thing, is to think about wars as being a mechanism to create debt that benefits the banking system. So this is nothing new. Ruling class plunder goes way back in Smedley Butler. So I'm going to now kind of delve into the history here. Smedley Butler was one of the early people to blow the whistle on this, although he was doing it. This quote from him: "War is a racket, always has been. A few profit and the many pay." Or this other one: "I spent most of my time being a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street, and for the bankers." And only a small inside group knows what it's about. It's conducted for the benefit of a few at the expense of the masses. So he was also known to be the whistleblower for the Money Trust business plot, which was a coup plan to assassinate FDR because FDR was a little bit too socialist. And I love this last quote from George Orwell. War against a foreign country only happens when the moneyed classes think they are going to profit from it. And as we go into this war against Iran, we should be thinking about that, I think, as we move forward. Who's profiting? Um, Ties between the mafia and and the FBI actually began before World War II. J. Edgar Hoover was primarily going after communists and organized and ignored organized crime for most of his career. And only under pressure from Kennedy in the 1960s did Hoover reluctantly undertake these investigations of organized crime. While Hoover was apparently blackmailing politicians and the mafia, he was in turn being blackmailed by the mafia. So there's indications that it was Meyer Lansky that was actually credited with obtaining compromising photos of the FBI director and kept him from investigating organized crime. Wall Street also has ties to the Nazis, and there's an old boy network. And this is Averell Harriman. Harriman was the former governor of New York and worked at Brown Brothers and Harriman, who had been financially entangled with assets of the Nazi Germany well after World War II had begun. And Harriman's bank employed Prescott Bush, which is the father and grandfather of our two Bush presidents. The Bushes survived and prospered each generation by making alliances with some of the most anti-American elements. You can go read about this in Joseph Trento's book, Prelude to Terror. Um, Also, the U.S. forces had captured banking documents held by the Nazis regarding Prescott Bush and the Brown brothers and Harriman. So by the time these records came to the CIA hands, the operations were run by Frank Wisner, John McCloy, we met a little bit earlier, and Alan Dulles. And the Bush and Harriman's families were basically protected from any embarrassment of this, from their financial collaborations with Hitler. And I think those kind of ties between the elites, even in a country you're fighting a war against, are just, quite amazing, I think. Now, how did the CIA get in bed with the mafia? Well, it really begins with the Office of Naval Intelligence. They're our oldest intelligence organization in the U.S. And before we invaded Sicily, we wanted to have some people on, eyes on the ground. And so we wanted to contact mafia figures. And the way to do that was through mafia figures that were in the U.S. So Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, and Lucky Luciano helped the Office of Naval Intelligence for the invasion of Sicily in a project called Operation Underworld. You can go read about that in Wiki also. But lurking in the background was the OSS, which was a brainchild of General William Donovan. Who was William Donovan? He was a prominent New York City antitrust lawyer. He's a veteran of World War I. And along with figures like Dewey and Dulles and Donovan, these were all consummate Eastern establishment insiders. And again, these early, as the CIA is getting created, it's through these connections to the banking industry. And I think I'll skip that. But it's not just us America that has these kind of connections. If you go look at at Japan during the war, how did World War II even get started? Well, for Japan, World War II started 50 years earlier, and it was basically an organized looting of East Asia, and at the turn of the century, and continued right up until the end of World War II. And in 1937, Japan invaded China. and the U.S. was supporting Chiang Kai-shek at that time in the civil war that was going on in China. Japan invades China, and the U.S. is supporting him, but we're also, California is providing oil and steel to power Japan's expanding war machine. So, and that went on until 6 months before Pearl Harbor. In fact, it was the cutoff of those oil and steel that we were providing that ran their war machine, which was basically a looting machine that led to Pearl Harbor and their invasion of Southeast Asia, um, in order to fund their war effort and keep their military-industrial complex going. And they did that with through a collaboration between the imperial family, which was its own kind of family syndicate, uh, the Zabatsu, which were basically the corporations, the conglomerates, the Kempetai, which were their Gestapo, and the Yakuza, which were their mafia. And these would well work together in the looting process. And I think this is a key ingredient that most people don't understand is the level of looting that went on for decades by the Japanese, and that ended up with such a massive amount of gold that we'll get to in just a minute. And we're officially told that Japan's wartime elite ended the war as impoverished victims, but in fact, many of the elite actually ended up richer than they were before the war. And that money was kept hidden because we wanted to keep a structure in place that was very right wing and would side with us in the fight against communism. Kodama here was one of the generals, but his job was to oversee the Yakuza during all of this looting. And it wasn't just the Japanese that were involved in looting during the war. The Nazis were also doing the same thing. Germany lacked critical resources that had to be supplied by South America, Italy, Spain, Portugal, and their African colonies. By the time Germany invaded Poland, Germany's central bank was broke, and it needed looted gold to continue the war. So it needed that looted gold was laundered by the Swiss banks. They would find the central bank of the country, Poland, for instance, or later Belgium and Holland. They would get the money, melt it down, put their own stamp on it, and give it to the Germans. Knew that this wasn't gold they were mining themselves, that it was actually stolen. It was illegal for the Swiss banks to do it, but they went along with it because it was profit making. And even the Vatican was involved in the laundering of this loot by the Nazis. And you can kind of see that loot was also funded by in collaboration. You can see between the Swiss and the Nazis in terms of Swiss corporations using prison labor during the war in Germany, but it's a Swiss corporation, or in this case, a gas mask factory. They were supplying gas masks to the Nazis. And the gold and loot confiscated by the Nazis, some of it was found after the war. This is a picture from the Merker salt mine, which was just full of a lot of the loot that eventually a lot of it ended up in this Black Eagle Trust. So the U.S. confiscated much of this loot after the war and put it into our own accounts to be used, to control the post-war rebuilding of Europe and Asia. So, but the Swiss treachery is, continued because a lot of the relatives of those who were killed during the war had Swiss bank accounts where they tried to hide some of their wealth, and the Swiss basically erected lots of barriers. So there's a whole aspect of this money laundering and looting by banks, which shows the banks to not necessarily be to not be trustworthy. And similarly, the Black Eagle Trust was founded in secret as used as a slush fund in this post-war period. Now, most of the money in the Black Eagle Trust came from Yamashita's gold. So the looting of Asia was just massive. And at some point after the Battle of Midway, Japan realized it was lose the war and decided to hide the loot in the Philippines, or at least some of the loot that they couldn't get back to Japan. And the idea was to hide the loot after the war was over, you'd recover this loot slowly and rebuild your empire. And after the war, Edward Lansdale, who was kind of a nobody, um, but ended up meeting this guy Santi, whose name is actually he's got came up by a lot of names, Severino Santaroma. But these two guys ended up torturing General Yamashita's driver. General Yamashita was in charge of the Philippines at the end to hold the line, keep the war going so they could bury all this loot in the Philippines. And there's a picture up here of some of that loot. And Santi was actually a double agent. He was actually an agent for the Vatican, ended up becoming the gatekeeper um, for the Black Eagle Trust. Pam, can you stop doing that? Um, and Santi uses his aliases on behalf of the CIA and becomes kind of a front man for the storage of these. And this is a picture of him down here. Eventually, Ferdinand Marcos gets control of a lot of his accounts, but then loses them to the CIA. So the post-war loot, which is confiscated and kept secret per Truman, ends up going into this Black Eagle Trust. And three funds get created, at that time. One is the M Fund, which is used for rebuilding the Japanese economy, but it's also they realize they're going to use it to control political parties to make sure communist parties and socialist parties don't come to power. And what they end up doing is using this M Fund to install basically the same people who were running Japan before the war ended. And then there was the Yosuda Fund, which was set to manipulate and steer Japanese underworld, and through Kodama, you met earlier, and his legions of Yakuza were used to suppress any kind of leftist activity. So again, it was to control the political things. And finally, there was a Keenan Fund, which was basically used for bribes so they could get the right outcomes quickly at the end of the war in the trials. One of the key figures in all this is Allen Dulles at the start of the CIA. So the OSS is formed during the war, and then Truman gets rid of the OSS, shuts it down when the war is over, and doesn't. The CIA is not in existence. And so by the end of World War II, Allen Dulles was doing something very illegal. It was now running a private intelligence services out of offices 44 Wall Street using some of the biggest names in American business. Dulles did not wait for the politicians who were debating over whether to have an intelligence agency. Dulles, who had done business with Hitler's supporters before the war, began a massive ex-Nazi recruitment campaign using State Department refugee offices as a front. And the enemy was now communism. So the enterprise and these people that came out of the banking industry, they saw communism as the biggest threat, more so than Nazism. So it was a quick pivot at that point to go after communism. And this is kind of, again, the basis of this anti-communism is the basis of the enterprise. So Dulles made sure investment bankers and lawyers who had done business with the Germans before and even during the war were back in touch with their old German contacts. And eventually they set up Operation Gladio, which was a stay behind of Nazis that were supported by the CIA. Truman initially resisted creating a CIA, and there was a question of whether it should be, if they were going to have an intelligence agency, should it be publicly or privately funded? If it's a privately funded, the CIA would give Wall Street complete control, but it wouldn't give legitimacy or immunity. So I think the decision was to do both. And so you have this public CIA gets created with Allen Dulles eventually appointed in 1953, and a private CIA which is in control of the Black Eagle Trust. So how does the enterprise come about? Well, it's really about seizing the initiative. And so some of these guys like Edward Lansdale and Ted Shackley, saw their opportunities and created it. So the enterprise is basically a privately run, self-funded intelligence syndicate. It's not answerable to Congress. You can do whatever Wall Street wants in this case. And its primary funding as a covert unit began with the Black Eagle Trust, and initial operations included accumulation of the Japanese war loot and money laundering and putting and setting up these accounts and fund anti-communist right-wing political parties. Um, how did Lansdale get in there? Well, he basically sold himself. He was something of a salesman, and having spent so much of his time as an ad agency man, he was easily able to con powerful men in Washington into believing that he had done this all by himself, which is get access to this Yamashita's gold. And Ted Shackley was another brilliant manipulator who understood how to exploit those around him. And one of the first things he did is befriended the son of a longtime CIA ally, Prescott Bush. So he's friends with Prescott Bush, takes George Bush, the first George Bush, under his wing, and there's quite a few notables that would be in this early enterprise formation. MacArthur was definitely in it. Bill Donovan, Ray Klein, John Singlaub, who's later involved in Iran-Contra, Bill Casey, of course, who was Paul Helliwell setting up banking systems, Lansdale, Dulles, Ted Shackley here, who just appears everywhere, Colby, and several generals that'll pop up later. Here's Paul Helliwell, and early on they're setting up the umbrella as some a conduit for this gold bullion. So what do you do with gold bullion? You want to deposit in a bank and have a piece of paper, because you can't just be paying off people with gold. You want to pay them with paper, and especially if the paper is something you can revoke at a later time. And these guys were involved in the first generations of Yamashita's gold recoveries. In 1950, Halliwell helped also arrange the purchase of some cargo planes that eventually became Air America. So you have to set up a whole supply chain and movement. They also set up the opium and heroin out of the Golden Triangle. The Golden Triangle is this area around Burma where the KMT, that's the leftover army from Chiang Kai-shek, ran opium, had their army basically paid by opium. And he also set up banks. So the Castle Bank was the first one. And later on, that Castle Bank becomes Nugan Hand Bank. And the Nugan Hand Bank, when it goes bust, the CIA shifts to the BCCI Bank, which controls a lot of these funds. And when the BCCI Bank fails, the next CIA bank is Citibank. And so there's this whole track of money laundering that's going on here. And Santi's role was really as a gatekeeper and facilitator for a lot of this money to give CIA deniability. And sometimes when I use CIA, I mean the enterprise at the same time. The China lobby is an important thing to understand here. So, and it's this really good book, China Mirage by James Bradley. China was fractured at the end of the war, and Chiang Kai-shek married into the wealthy Soong family syndicate to create the China lobby for funding the U.S. Fight against communism or against Mao. And he was primarily funded by America, because it was awkward because we were funding the Japanese war machine when they invaded China. But this syndicate between Chiang Kai-shek and the Soong sisters was really skimming a lot of money. And the people involved included Defense Secretary Lewis Johnson, who was basically giving secrets to top secrets to the syndicate, during his while he was Defense Secretary. So that this lobby really got into it, and there's a lot of parallels between that and what you see with the Zionist lobby nowadays. In the book Gold Warriors, you read more about the same thing, that Donovan and Angleton forged a three-way alliance with the Mafia and the post-war Christian Democratic Party and the Vatican in order to control efforts in Europe, so you didn't have communists. And so, in fact, Coppola, who I skipped over before, but his main mission was to get the mafioso into the Christian Democratic Party to make sure that you didn't have communists in Italy. And in Asian, Donovan was a registered agent of the Thai government, and they moved opium and heroin out of the Golden Triangle. They funded the nationalist Chinese army, which was had to cross into Burma eventually and seize control of the Golden Triangle drug operations. And these some of these forces became the primary movers of drugs in the international market, aided by Air America, the CIA plane. So you can read about that in those books. In the meantime, um, uh, Mao has a victory in China, and now the enterprise operations are added to covert wars against China. So this next generation of enterprise recruits for these anti-communists are really end up being ex-military with flying skills, or connections to the underworld, because those are the ones that are the most useful in these profit-making ventures. And the CIA created a pair of front companies to supply and finance 12,000 KMT soldiers that were in that area. And again, this is Helliwell did this, and if you see some of the movies like about Air America, that's this enterprise. Um, Chinese lobby also, under the Truman administration, really got us into the Korean War. And there's a great line from I Have Stone's book. This is a great book, Hidden History of Korean War. No one really seems to know just how the United States have been drawn into the Korean War, but there's less doubt about who wanted to stop it and who wanted to continue. Chiang Kai-shek and its principal. This is the head of Chiang Kai-shek was the Nationalist Party in Taiwan. Ri was in South Korea, were the principal beneficiaries of this. Unfortunately, the same political and economic factors that pressed the Korean War now press for its extension. Truman and Eccleston feared that peace would cause economic problems because the economy was running great because we had a war economy. So and there was also another thing. Truman and Eccleston had a dream of building up enough strength to the point where Moscow and half of the world with it would be forced into unconditional surrender, and because we had the atomic bomb, and we faced the prospect that this wasn't going to work when toward the middle of the Korean War, we sent 8 of these flying B-29 flying fortresses north to go bomb this airport that was being built in North Korea, in the far stretches of North Korea, and the North Koreans and the Chinese attacked it with 150 MiGs. And what we found out at that moment was that these planes, which were part of the plan to eventually provoke China and invade China and bomb them with nuclear weapons, were sitting ducks, to be taken out of the sky. And so of those 8 planes, 3 of them went down before they even got there, and the others got shot up and had to be abandoned or crashed on landing. So it's an interesting aspect where we thought we had domination in weaponry, and in fact it was just the opposite. And we're seeing some of that in I think we're going to see some of that in Iran now. So after Truman becomes Eisenhower, and this becomes the beginning of CIA coups. We have Mossadegh gets couped, Arbenz gets couped and embarrassed. Patrice Lumumba is assassinated. The CIA comes into its own under Dulles. Now, one of the other things that happened under Eisenhower that because I want to focus on the corruption, was in 1960, Vice President Nixon gave one of the biggest of these funds, which I mentioned earlier, the M Fund, to the leaders of Japan's Liberal Democratic Party in return for their promise of kickbacks to Nixon's campaign for the American presidency. This is in 1960. So the M Fund, then worth about $35 billion, and since it has controlled Japan, the LDP has controlled Japan and buy elections and buy people off, uh, um, creating basically a one-party dictatorship, and to block any meaningful reforms that look at all socialists. So again, part of the corruption. I don't want to say much about JFK and his presidency, but I do recommend a book, JFK and the Unspeakable by James Douglas. It's a book that Ray McGovern recommended some time ago, but it'll discuss JFK's actions or inactions that made him so many enemies, and I've listed them here, and I don't going to go through them. But he had plenty of enemies: the Mafia, the CIA, elements of the Enterprise, Cubans, Israelis, military-industrial. He for his actions during the time basically set him up for this assassination, and I think it was organized by the Enterprise. Um, and apparently through something called Operation 40. So you can go look up Operation 40, or ZR Rifle is another name for it. And this was retasked from Castro assassination to JFK assassination. And Enterprise member Alan Dulles ran the cover for that on the Warren Commission. So then we have LBJ in the decade of assassinations, and I think it's important to recognize LBJ was a member of the Texas Oil Syndicate, which sometimes referred to as Suite 8F. That's where they met. But he had these mob ties that I mentioned earlier, and is at least loosely tied to the Enterprise. And the Enterprise ended up being in charge of the JFK cover-up. The Warren Commission was appointed by LBJ just days afterwards. John McCoy, Alan Dulles, and Gerald Ford were all members of the Enterprise. Earl Warren was blackmailed by Johnson to chair the commission, and dirt on Hoover was used to get Warren to do that. And the other three members of the Warren Commission refused to sign the initial draft of the Warren Report without a qualifying statement. So that's important. But similar kind of cover-ups were happened, throughout this decade. And there are two other things I want to mention that happened during LBJ. One is the 1964 LBJ gave James Angleton permission to assist Israel in further developing its nuclear weapons program. And boy, we're seeing that today, because Israel's the only country in the Middle East with nuclear weapons. So, but that began under Lyndon Johnson. And it was under Lyndon Johnson that Marcos is installed and begins his search for Yamashita's gold. So you can read about LBJ's corruption in the book Dark Quadrant, which I'd recommend, but again, it involves Bobby Baker, who you see here with Lyndon Johnson, and Clint Murchison here. One of the lines that I really like is through Baker's influence, businessmen with ties to the underworld infiltrated Washington political circles, and it represented a blatant challenge to the Kennedy administration's war on organized crime. And that's probably part of the reason for Bobby Kennedy's assassination. So Marcos was installed in 1965, and who was he? He was just kind of a sharp young politician, and he heard about Santee's recovery of gold, and he aggressively courted that, and eventually he convinced the United States that he would be a good person to be in charge in the Philippines. So. And so there's some sections from the Gold Warriors where you can go read about what he did. One of the more interesting characters was this guy Rojas, you can see here, who found this solid gold Buddha, whose head you could take off, and was full. There were all these jewels inside, and when Marcos found out about that, he sent his thugs to confiscate the golden Buddha, and Rojas was arrested, tortured, and ultimately poisoned. In a court case in 1996, he eventually won a judgment against him, but I don't think they were ever able to collect on it. So Marcos is on his route for finding the gold. A couple of other small events. U.S. is running the war in Vietnam during this time, and we don't have the money to do it. And so there was a danger. This presented a danger, and so this book, Super Imperialism by Michael Hudson, is a good book to go read. But in 1964, foreign dollar holdings had grown to exceed the U.S. gold stock, so we could no longer keep the gold standard. And several attempts were made, but nobody kind of realized that the U.S. economy, even though it seemed to be really strong, you know, was in really deep trouble because of its trade deficits. And so they worked out a solution, and the solution was that Chase Bank was asked if it could set up branches in the Caribbean to attract hot money. And by hot money, we're talking about looted money by dictators and drug lords and so on. And and then that money would be circulated back to avoid this trade deficit. So that was sort of the band-aid, But the fact that the U.S. is purposely attracting drug dealers, criminals, and even Cold War adversaries to put their money in U.S. treasuries on offshore banks that eventually are part of the American banking system. And an interesting part of that is that the U.S. government gave the world's criminals and tax evaders special incentives denied to its own taxpayers. So we go to all kinds of steps to create that. So as you can read here, I stuck this in to give you a little bit of a break. And now on to Nixon. um, Nixon uh, uh, finally went off the gold standard. I think this is important. Nixon was not a cabal member. He was not a member of the Enterprise, but he was controllable. In fact, his political career was funded by the Enterprise and a network of people that weren't really loyal to Nixon, but really to the cabal, to the Enterprise, were the doing the a lot of the dirty tricks for Nixon. Um, Nixon ended the gold standard, and then the petrodollar became kind of this gimmick to keep the dollar as the global reserve currency. And what the petrodollar really is a is a an agreement with the Arab oil states and all those states that all oil contracts would be denominated in dollars so that foreign reserves of dollars would be necessary for oil purchases. And since oil is so important, that was a key. And any threat of invasion to any oil exporting countries for not selling oil in dollars, which we saw later enforced. Both Libya and Iraq invasions were about their, at least partly were due to their threats to not sell oil in dollars. One other thing that happened during Nixon was the creation of the DEA. Um, and the DEA was basically created right out of the CIA. And in Douglas Valentine, a great author of the Phoenix Program, has written in this document here, the DEA and its predecessor, the Federal Drug Enforcement Organizations, has always been infiltrated to varying degrees and managed by Americans' intelligence agencies. The reason is simple. The U.S. government has been protecting drug smuggling allies, especially in organized crime, since trafficking was first criminalized in 1914. So I think that's one of the, again, connections to this corrupt underworld. And what about Watergate? Um, Toward the end of Nixon's first term, he began making plans to purge the entire senior leadership of the CIA. Nixon didn't trust the people that were in the CIA. And there's theories out there, and I think there's some good evidence that the Watergate scandal, that we understand it, was really more of a coup that was orchestrated to eventually get rid of him and install an acceptable member of the Enterprise, Gerald Ford, in as president. So I think that's something you can come back and look at this. So Ford administration comes in, and but it doesn't last. So instead, Jimmy Carter wins the next election, and begins formal investigations of and purges within the CIA by Admiral Stanfield Turner, and to shut down a lot of the black ops. And at this point, what does the Enterprise do? Well, it establishes a foreign-funded private CIA called the Safari Club, and here's kind of a picture of it. But Colby and Bush are all part of that whole thing, And involved in that are Ted Shackley, Tynes, and Edward Wilson, a number of people, in this because they were worried that Carter wouldn't be doing these kind of covert ops. And in fact, they carried on a number of actions in Africa. Um, but Jimmy Carter's presidency was undermined. So he had people within his party, within his cabinet that were undermining. William Sullivan was one of them, and who had ties to Ted Shackley. And Ted Shackley has a great line here that Ted Shackley and Sullivan could be, President Carter did not understand how people like Ted Shackley and Sullivan, how ruthless they could be. These men would betray a comrade in arms in the name of policy. To betray a sitting president they did not particularly like and was in many ways a lesser matter. Shackley was prepared to use every resource, every trick in the book to help remove Carter and Turner from office so they could get back in charge. And Brzezinski is one of his key national security advisor was actually had a relationship with Ted Shackley. So again, Ted Shackley comes in to undermining. Here's Brzezinski here. And I think I'll skip this, but it's worth investigating that it was under Carter that we actually started the creation of jihadists to fight the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, but kind of a brainchild of Brzezinski, which gets retasked later on. So 1980 comes along, and we have the second October surprise, and I think this is important. That Bush and Casey basically convinced Iran not to release the hostages before the 1980 election in exchange for $40 million in weapons sales, and that's backed by some of the former pilots who were running arms during that thing. But one of the I was never sure quite whether I wanted to believe this or not until I came across this article about the Camarati plane crash. And that's also an interesting thing. Around this same time after the election, there was the assassination of the Portuguese prime minister and the defense minister who had access to, who could expose the October surprise, had the evidence, and they went down in a plane crash. And it was kind of suspicious what the plane crash, but nobody knew. But once the statute of limitations had kicked in, then two of the people that were involved in it, Francisco Simon and Jose Estevez, confessed that they had been hired by the intelligence agency to bring down the plane. Ronald Reagan's time in office was clearly involved a lot of the mob. His mob connections come in through Lew Wasserman, who sponsored his career, and Lew Wasserman had the connection to Cindy Korshak, who was the mob lawyer. Ray Donovan here had his own connections to mob money laundering, and one of the lines I want to point out is as the Donovan probe intensified, a key government witness against him, Fred Fiorino, was found in the trunk of his own car in Manhattan with a bullet in his head. So these people that are involved in this they're not squeamish, just like in the case of political assassination, but it's killing people who might be a problem. And what else happens? Well, the U.S. encourages Iraq to invade Iran. We always forget about the original Iraq-Iran war, back in 1979. In fact, during the Carter administration, the CIA staged a failed coup with Saddam Hussein and the remnants of the old Iranian government who sought refuge in Iraq. And while we openly supported Saddam and gave him all kinds of political support and monetary support, we were also at the same time selling using Israel as a middleman to purchase U.S. weapons. So we were funding both sides. We wanted to destroy both countries so that Israel would be the top country in the nation, in the region. Iran-Contra, illegal sales of weapons to Iran using the profits to fund the operation of the Contra, that was only part of the thing. The savings and loan collapses that were happening during that time were also being run by the same North Secord and Singlog group. So the same people that were running Iran-Contra were running all of these scams to suck money out of the banking system. Uh, and uh, and I think this is a key thing. But most of this money wasn't actually going to fund the Iran-Contra. Most of the money was actually getting funneled into the Republican Party and people who are funding the Republican Party. So you can read about that in Pete Bruton's book or Whitney Webb or the Seagraves book or a number of books that talk about this. And we shouldn't forget Clinton. Clinton, who was governor during the Reagan administration, was actually part of the whole Iran-Contra affair because Mena, Arkansas, was a central drug delivery hub and arms, export hub for Iran-Contra. And here's a couple of the pilots that were running drugs and arms. Um, Barry Seal eventually is killed because he knows too much. And who was why was Clinton doing this? Well, he had a handler. He had a CIA point handler named Robert Johnson. But Robert Johnson, it turned out, was just his front name. Who he really was William Barr up here in the corner. William Barr is somebody you'll see even in the Trump administration. He comes and goes. He eventually ends up being the cover-up for the Iran-Contra affair when he's Attorney General. So what's a savings and loan scandal? $600 billion in bailouts, for a number of scams. Uh, um, and I won't go into the details here, but you can read the book. The book by Pete Bruton really goes into this. But the CIA was heavily involved in making sure that these scams worked. And so if anybody who was high up got caught, they would get a get out of jail free card from the CIA saying they're intelligence, just like we saw the first time with Jeffrey Epstein. So who are the people involved? The Bush family, not only the Keatings, but Jeb and Neil Bush and George Bush. They were all involved in these scams. And this is a list from Pete Bruton's book of all the people involved, just the main characters in the book. And I just list that just to kind of show you, but you can see the Bushes up here, Lloyd Benson up here, John Conley, a number of names you wrote, Adnan Khashoggi. These are all people involved in it. And I'm just putting this up for 10 seconds just to say that these kind of scams, you would buy up a property like a mall for $35 million, sell it and sell it until the last sale was worth, $150 million. And then you'd use it as collateral to borrow money and then you'd default the loans. And so the banks would end up with a $35 million mall, that they'd lend out $150 million on. So that's kind of how the scams would work. And there's some interesting characters. Al Martin was a character who was a self-described fourth level player. He's got a book called The Conspirators, and you can use that kind of to make these connections. He was right in there. And one of the lines that I really, found interesting was this line from in his book where he talks about Jeb Bush said, of course, Morales will never leave prison alive. And the day before Morales was to be released, he did in fact slip on a bar of soap in the prison shower and died as a result of the fall. And he was supposed to go to Washington to discuss his knowledge about Iran-Contra the next day. Or Mr. Molina, who was another person that involved, had in fact committed suicide that evening by discharging the entire 20-round clip of a MAC-10 into his own body. And of course, by the following day, the body had been quickly cremated. So those are the kind of, you get rid of the low people on it. And there were about, in this thing, according to Al Martin, there was about 4,000 people involved in these scams across Texas and a number of other states, Florida and California. And most of the money ended up going to the Republican Party or a Republican principal, some of it to fund the Contras. And of course, you need a Contra cover-up. Who was involved in the Contra cover-up? This guy, Robert Mueller, who we saw, involved in the Russiagate scandals. He's kind of another one of the cover-up people. Dick Cheney was involved in the cover-ups of Iran-Contra, and this guy, John Hines, who chaired a three-man presidential review board of the Iran-Contra affair. had in his possession all the damning documents from that affair, but he was killed in a plane crash. And that's a lot of people. It's an amazing number of people who are killed in plane crashes. John Tower was killed like the next day and was also involved in this. Was somebody who clearly had knowledge of a lot of this, but it's not quite clear that wasn't an accident. Why didn't the FBI or DOJ prosecute? Well, when you have AGs that are all corrupt, that's what happens. FBI agents are somewhat independent of the attorney generals, but the FBI agents rarely have the desire or ability to track down piles of complicated, tedious bank records and decipher them. The one thing that Pete Bruton did is he actually did that kind of legwork as a journalist to write his book, Mafia, CIA, and George Bush. And even if there's that rare FBI agent who goes through, he or she normally runs into a brick wall at the U.S. Attorney General's office. In Congress, what do? Well, they provide another layer of protection by failing to exercise any power to track the flow of money. And if none of those work, the CIA will just say, well, they work for the agency, so don't investigate them. And an example of that of some of this is the strange case of Dan Childs. He was a CIA agent. He joins the CIA 19 years later. He's on the Senate committee and helps derail all the investigations that happened in the Senate Intelligence Committee after when Carter was in power. And then as soon as Reagan he goes back and works for the CIA under Bill Casey. But then when the Iran-Contra investigations happen, he moves to the House Intelligence Committee and helps direct that to make sure that nothing comes out of it. And that's the way the CIA controls a lot of these efforts. So Yamashita's gold. Listen, I've got to close up here in the next 5 minutes. Sorry. Yamashita's treasure. This guy, Prince Tanaga, was one of the guys overseeing the gold that was captured out of East Asia. And he had a servant, this guy, Ben Valmores. And Ben was kind of a young, very loyal person. And at the end, after all the gold got buried, along with all the people that were dug the tunnels, he was supposed to be in there. But Takeda liked him a lot and decided not to have him killed, and instead gave him a whole set of copies of the maps and told him to go back to his village, and he'd come back in 30 years and get them. And he did that partly because he was worried he might go down in a submarine and not be able to return the maps to Japan. And so eventually Ben Valmores, Marcos gets wind of him, and Marcos's massive amounts of gold really come from a lot of the treasure that was recovered by maps that this guy provided. So Marcos gets this gold, and you can read this book by Sterling's. And the amazing part of the book is they have CDs that reproduce a lot of their work, and so you can kind of really check out what they did. But the Marcoses go through a process where they basically get the massive amounts of gold. They even blackmail Japan. And if you notice his picture getting smaller, at some point the Enterprise gets heavily involved in his efforts, and he needs the Enterprise because they can help do the money laundering. And eventually Reagan, under Reagan, Casey gets in with Klein and Slinglom and these other guys, and they decide they need to get Marcos to give the gold to the CIA. And he holds out, and this is kind of a list of him holding out. The Council Trilateral Commission goes after him and says, "You better give us the gold," and Secretary Reagan, number of people, and finally they coup him. Marcos is cooed. He's carted off to Hawaii, and all his gold deposits are and his paper certificates to show that he has this gold in all these banks are declared counterfeit and confiscated, and the CIA gets control of it. So there's several other things that happened during this period, including the theft of Inslaw's Promise software, which is what got Danny Casolaro killed investigating that. There's books about that. The Last Circle is a good book that describes this, but there's a number of characters. This guy this guy puts a back door in this database software that gets distributed not only to all of these prosecutors around the world to manage their tracking criminals, but also gets distributed to banks. And the number of agents and so on involved in that. I'll skip talking about the Lockerbie crash because it's also tied into one of these operations. It's an amazing book, Trail of the Octopus, and what we were told about Lockerbie being Libya is not really correct. It was Iran, and it was a revenge for us downing one of their planes. But how the plane got selected is quite the story. And the Bush cover-up, Bill Barr was making sure that this goes on, that we had this cover-up, and but now we needed an enemy if we're going to, as the Soviet Union's going down. So Saddam Hussein becomes the new enemy to justify, the military-industrial complex. And what a lot of people don't know is that the ambassador to Iraq at that time said, "We have no opinion on the Arab conflict." So then this conflict was between Iraq and Kuwait, and basically gave the the green light for Saddam to invade Kuwait. And what happened? All the Gulf Arab states became frightened, and we went in and built bases. And so that's how we got really, intimate control that we have today, with all our bases that are currently getting blown up by Iran. So, but Bush loses, and to Clinton. But one other thing I want to this is the last closing thing, and that's Project Hammer. And Project Hammer was, once the Enterprise got hold of all that money, what did it use it for? And so in the Seagraves, they talk about Project Hammer as being used, run by General Crock. Here, Cocky, you can see him here with MacArthur, and he testified that he knew that Project Hammer had assets of $1 trillion at that point. And so it was being used also to run Citibank. Citibank CEO, this guy's OSS, head of Citibank. He trains the next guy and the next guy, John Reed. And these guys are all have ties into the CIA. And who's the last one? Robert Rubin. You recognize him from the Clinton administration. So there's all these connections again between banks and the CIA. But Project Hammer has something a bit bigger. What the public record suggests is that beginning with the first Bush presidency, George Bush needed a program of covert economic warfare to bring about the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, what does that sound like? That sounds like what we did to Iran last December, when we started using currency manipulation and so on to try to break the country. And this project consisted of four major operations: the theft of the Soviet treasury, currency destabilization of the ruble, funding of the KGB generals in August, a coup against Gorbachev, and the takeover of key energy and defense industries in the Soviet Union. So this is what those billions of dollars that was confiscated from Marcos was used for, is to do this operation. And the coup that we always think about, where in August of 1991, which eventually put Yeltsin, gave the rise to the rise of Yeltsin, was initiated in the last days of Gorbachev, and the rise of Yeltsin by Bush and a cadre of rogue KGB officials built a complex of international network of banks and holding companies that were used to take ownership of the Soviet economy. Over 300 of these KGB traders who supported this operation and would later be relocated to the U.S. in the early 1990s in pensions. So it looks like this money was used to cause that. It always bothered me, how did the Soviet Union collapse so quickly? And so this money that was taken from Marcos was eventually retasked to bring down the Soviet Union. And there's a few others involved. George Bush, this guy Leo Wanta up here was also involved in the bullion transfer. This guy Grigory Matyukin, I don't remember if I'm pronouncing his name right, was a KGB official who was involved heavily in it. And even Alan Greenspan at the time coordinated some of the operations and fronting 240 billion is what they think was the cost in this analysis up here. And that was created out of the war chest of Marcos gold. And so eventually Yeltsin is put in, and um, I think I'm going to end it at that. These are just some of the other people that were involved in this, and I'll leave this up long enough to if you want to come back and see some more of the details and where to get them. And that's just kind of an example of the connections for that coup between Mossad, the Yeltsin group, um, and Dick Cheney controlling these guys, and KGB officials involved, and Bush representing the enterprise. And so I'll end it there and leave up the conclusions that I started with. And sorry for talking so long.
Thanks so much, James. Well, we've got 10 minutes left if anyone wants to comment or get some clarifying questions on any of the, phrases, definitions, maybe. There was a lot of information here, James, so feel free to raise your hand, anyone. The floor is open for another 10 minutes. James, I have a question. It's hard to know where to jump in here because it's this like a breadth of, a span of time and it goes so deep. But, how does this syndicate keep its power going generation after generation? Are there any overarching themes and ways this happens that you've gleaned through your research?
So I think it's critical how you run these accounts. So first of all, that was one of the things that Paul Helliwell learned how to do, is how to set up offshore bank accounts and to do this kind of money laundering and gold transfers. You needed banks that were willing to cooperate in this. And who was the bank of choice? UBS. The Swiss were the banks of choice. They'd take the gold. They're happy to have these kind of reserves in their vaults, and they got deep vaults. And then what do they give you in return? They give you a piece of paper. So you need to, so is the paper, a valid piece of paper? Well, if you're the CIA, hold on to the paper, or the CIA's representative, which these guys were, the banks were not going to mess with the CIA. But if you were an individual, like if you were this guy Santi, if you were one of his descendants, and you showed up at the bank with these gold bear bonds, they would just say, nope, they're counterfeit. We're going to hold on to them, and if you contest it, we're going to put you in jail for trying to pass counterfeit, gold bear. So the banks had ways of eliminating people, and confiscating this money, and they were in collusion with the CIA or the enterprise, in having this. And you just, and it's when you have a bearer bond, it's like the whole structure of the banking system, is around this kind of that these things are secure.
Kim, I see your hand. Go ahead.
Okay. Thanks, James. That was quite a bit of information to digest. I'm wondering, did you leave anybody out? So I was wondering, in your research, did you come across the name DeBartolo? Remember Eddie DeBartolo, who owned the 49ers? I think he He was part of the Mafia. I think he
Yeah.
went to jail eventually. I'm wondering if you came across his name in any of the.
I did, and I'm trying to remember, but it wasn't in any of the books here that I'm talking about right now. And I think his, it would be like the second half, this is like World War II to the end of the Cold War. I think there's a whole nother story from the post-Cold War period where these guys continue on because you see these names popping up, Mueller and others, So, but I can't remember any,
Yeah.
DeBartolo right off the top of my head.
And I was interested in more information about the savings and loans, but you did have a slide or two about that with a book recommendation, so I could check that out.
Yeah, there's several books that go into that, maybe three or four of them are on that list are about the savings and loans. And but I think Pete Bruce Brewster Bruton, Pete Bruton, is probably has the best. He was an investigative journalist, and he really went and dug around and really found out a lot about how these frauds were going on. So I think that he's probably the best one.
Okay. Okay, thanks.
Glenn, you're up. Go ahead and unmute, Glenn.
Epstein's been in the news a lot. I assume he's part of the blackmail branch of the CIA or whatever.
Yeah. Did you have more you wanted to ask or just?
Well, no, I just wondered,
Yeah.
where does the blackmail and all these revelations about, the prince and et cetera, like
Yeah.
everybody's there.
So Whitney Webb's book, One Nation Under Blackmail, is a good place to start because it really outlines. It's a 2-volume set and it's pretty long, but it's blackmail was going on quite a bit, especially around Hoover. The Roy Cohn was involved in this kind of blackmail. Um, uh, uh, Robert Maxwell. There's a book I read about Robert Maxwell. Wasn't particularly good because it kind of whitewashed a lot of the people around him. But Robert Maxwell was clearly involved in a lot of this criminal activity, and somehow had Epstein was under his wing. I think he was somehow recognized early on as having the right kind of immoral lack of conscience to be able to would fit right in with these kind of activities, so you know and was had no qualms about not only blackmailing people but mostly about his understanding of how to hide things in offshore accounts and to do all kinds of money laundering, and so he played a useful role, and I'm pretty sure was an asset of Mossad, so but that story of Epstein would kind of pick up about where this story ends, so you know
Jim, you're up. And then if we could go ahead and hear from Marjorie as well, and then because we just got a couple minutes left, and then let Jim wrap it up. James,
Yeah,
wrap it up.
yeah, 10 minutes. Hell, we need 10 hours. Um, what we'll do, Jim, is we'll sometime perhaps we'll take this and put it through. We'll sit there and argue about this because it'll take a couple of sessions because all those slides are very interesting.
Yeah.
Intersectionality of it all is where I would want to more critically look because, when you start dealing with, let's say, for example, the issue of you raised the Mafia in 1943, how they're working with the Navy, there's all these interesting questions that come out of it. And each of those slides are very rich and there's a lot to explore in each of them. So perhaps for another time, but thank you.
Yes.
Marjorie.
Yes, thank you. That was amazing. And I look forward to seeing those slides and getting more into it. And thank you for all this work you've done. But But I heard testimony this last week that Epstein actually said that I represent the Rothschilds at some point. And there has been connections that have come out, even regarding Hillary and the Rothschilds coming to the wedding of their daughter and other things. But the Robert Maxwell connection, he was the father of Ghislaine Maxwell. And when he died, they, he apparently fell off his boat, but he was buried in the Mount of Olives. He was proclaimed to be Mossad and one of the greatest spies they had. So all these connections that you're making, I guess they've continued on,
Yeah,
So,
I think Robert Maxwell was also, if you read his book, Robert Maxwell, Super Spy,
yes.
it was Mossad that killed him.
Oh,
And
you think
he had
so?
he had a huge kind of empire, which he was moving money around and laundering and doing all kinds of things and using stolen technology. He was actually, selling the Promise software. An Israeli version of the Promise software was one of his sources of funds. And what's thought is that he was his knowledge of what went on during the coup that in Russia that basically brought down the Soviet Union, that he was trying to use that to prop up, to get a bailout from Israel, to prop up his empire, his media empire and stuff.
Really?
And if you read that book, outlines what I think happened, and and it was Mossad that killed him for that, trying to blackmail Mossad.
Oh,
If you don't
God.
give me this couple $1 billion that I need to bail out my businesses, then I'm going to spill the beans on what you guys did. And